What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club
With Julia!
And Victoria.
We are two lifelong friends who usually read a book and talk about it each episode.
This is a podcast where we explore new perspectives and we use books as tools for personal and community growth.
This week, it's very exciting. We are talking to author Rebecca Stott about her new novel, Dark Earth, set in 6th century Britain, about two sisters with dangerous secrets.
Rebecca Stott is an award-winning writer, historian, and broadcaster. She writes both fiction and nonfiction, from historical novels to novelistic history books. Her memoir, In the Days of Rain, about growing up in a cult, won the Costa Biography Prize in 2017. She has taught literature and creative writing in British universities for 32 years, but has just given up her university job to become a freelance writer. Dark Earth is Rebecca's third novel and is now available in the UK and US. Welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, when your publishers reached out to us about your book, we were very excited. Powerful women, magic, swords especially. Julia loves swords.
I love swords! I was so excited. I was like, she's a sword forger!
So we were like, this is perfect. And so happy that the timing worked out to not only read the book, but have you on as well.
Yeah!
To start out, we'd love to hear your experience with reading. What was the first thing you read that made you think like, oh yeah, I also want to tell stories?
Oh, well, my background is a bit unusual. My childhood was a bit unusual insofar as the cult that I was part of, that my book In the Days of Rain is about, forbade us from reading books as children.
Whoa.
So I was a child with a very big imagination and not much to feed it on. So there was an awful lot of Bible reading. So a lot of our early games were Bible-based stories. But then when I went to school, we were not allowed to bring library books home from school. We could read encyclopedias and factual things, but we were not allowed to read made-up stories. And so I stole into the library one day when I was about 6 or 7 and pulled out an Enid Blyton book called The Secret Island and started reading it. I mean, and all the Enid Blyton books are just fantastic. There's Secret this and Secret that. I remember seeing Secret on the spine of the book and thinking that was especially exciting. But it was a story about a group of kids who were running away from from bad adults. And of course, the whole story was so brilliant to me because it was about kids being in charge and kids making up their own minds and kids making decisions about stuff and living on an island completely by themselves. They were about, 10 or something, being completely independent. So that was just blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. I hid it under the beanbag in the library and kept coming back and reading it whenever I could. So it was like especially delicious because it was my first proper big story with children in charge.
Yeah.
It had Secret on the spine and it was my secret. It was underneath the beanbag. So adventure stories are especially precious to me. So, in a way, Dark Earth is an adventure story and it's also about an island. And, I think that book just keeps, because it was such a visceral experience for me and so exciting that, I think that book probably keeps on repeating in my fiction a lot.
Wow.
That's incredible that you not only, like, what a story for your first book and how influential it was.
That's something we really love to talk about I can speak for Victoria. Like, we get very passionate about the importance of children's literature in like when we were kids, helping us imagine our own agency and making up our own minds. So that's like a really incredible example of that, where like you were able to, it gave you something to imagine that you hadn't been exposed to before.
Yeah, and I mean, a book that, at the heart of it, it was a book that was saying maybe grown-ups aren't always right.
Yeah.
Which is like a really big deal for children.
Mm-hmm.
Good book.
So then, like, when abouts did you start writing?
Probably. I mean, I've still got some of my school books, and they are, from my secondary school, full of little, crazy little stories that, we were all required to write. But I think probably in my teens, I wrote a lot of very, very strange, very dark things, very dark stories. But I didn't really start to write. I went to university. I became an academic. I was a historian for a long time, and I've taught literature. So mainly I learned to write by writing academic books, and then I got really, really sick of it. I got really sick of writing academic prose. And all the time people would be saying, this is all a bit flowery, the academic prose, because I was trying to do things that were imaginative, to try to imagine myself into the head of this historical character or that historical character. So I think it was going to happen at some point, and I got to about late 30s probably before I broke out and broke away. My first books were history books, but written novelistically, written with suspense and lots of colour. And I enjoyed it so much. It was like being given my head for the first time, Yeah, it was just, and once that had happened, once I'd written kind of novelistic history books, then I wrote my first novel. But I've never really written short stories. I like the big canvas. I like intricate plots and characters, moving through time. So I've never really mastered that art. And I'm always so impressed by people who can and do. Because, to turn a story on a pin rather than having this great big canvas to write in.
I'm curious. Okay, first of all, totally love the experience, like the story of like coming out of this very restrictive childhood, and you find the fiction and the fantasy writing as such like an open door for your imagination, and then seeing that parallel in your own writing career as you've written very academic and formal writing, and then using that as an entry point to open up into the fantasy and the fiction as well. It's so beautiful. And I'm curious, like, as you've been transitioning between the novelistic historical nonfiction into the fictional novel, what kind of had a change in your approach, and how does kind of that process of writing feel different as you move into writing more novels?
I guess, in university we would probably call it critical writing. Yeah, critical writing and creative writing. And for me, those things started out being a bit of a binary, being like, oh, am I going to do this book this way or this way? And what I realised more and more as I went on is that it's more of a spectrum. It's all writing. It's all storytelling in a way. Even an academic book is kind of telling a story. It's pitching an idea. It's taking the reader through time. So for me, what I try to do, instead of thinking that the two things are opposites or binaries, that I move up and down the spectrum, and that I might move up and down the spectrum within a single book as well. So, for instance, my first book, Ghost Walk, is probably my most complicated book. It's a story about Isaac Newton. It's got a dual time frame. And within it, I had an academic character who was a central character who was writing a book about Isaac Newton. So excerpts from her book go into the novel. And there are actually footnotes to her book, some of which I started playing around with because I love the idea of kind of fake footnotes. So most of the footnotes were accurate, like you could actually find a book with that page number and that, would be there. And sometimes I made up stuff and slipped it in. So that book was a mixture of fiction and non-fiction. And I think in lots of ways, it's not to everyone's taste because it's quite a complicated book, but I had such fun writing it. And I want to do that again. I guess all of my books to some extent are playing around with that fiction, non-fiction boundary. The biggest difference with fiction is that you do dialogue, and in non-fiction, your characters don't speak. You don't make up things. It's all mainly true. But I like mixing that so that you've got, because I love the research. I'm a historian. And I love really, really going deep into, understanding about how swords are made or about plague in the 17th century. And so it's kind of mixing fact and fiction is what I do.
That sounds so fun. Like, I don't know, the way you talk about it, of having this kind of sense of play, I suppose, of like not boxing yourself in anywhere. Like, oh, let's try this. Let's add some fake footnotes let's get crazy. As someone who's currently doing a lot of academic writing and getting very bogged down in it, and, a lot of my training was in, sort of a mixture, but I did a lot of creative writing in my bachelor's, and now I'm back writing the, like, analytical essays, and I'm like, I feel sometimes you get so excited by the idea, and then the form, the structure feels kind of uninspiring sometimes.
Yeah, I still think, though, I really do think there's a lot you can do within critical writing.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the common denominator is thinking always about the experience of the reader. So that, for me, that's paramount. Sometimes I forget, and then when I come back to a draft, I'm thinking, okay, this is a good enough draft, but what would the reader make of this? What's their experience? What's the joy in this for them? And I think the same questions apply for critical writing as well. Some critical writing is so dull because it's really, it's so turgid, and that's not a nice experience for the reader. And I think good critical writing can often be, without being flowery, as people used to accuse me of being, I think it's possible to be rich and vivid and engaging in critical writing, and not enough people are encouraged to do that.
Yeah.
There, that's my hobby horse for today. It's been one of my obsessions, actually, is working with, because I teach literature and I teach creative writing. So I teach academic prose, and I teach, or used to, I've given it up now. It was always a big thing for me to encourage students to find ways of writing delightfully, as well as getting the footnotes right, and, being fluent, being elegant, and being, taking the reader on a journey, even if that journey is a kind of argumentative one.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I wish I had had you as a professor. I find for a lot of people, I think they just copy what they see, and sometimes what they see is quite dull.
Dull. We both use that word at the same time.
Yeah. All right. I could talk about that forever, but we were also really excited to see that you write for radio. We were curious if there's like do you find it any different in constructing the structure that you use for those pieces? And also, do you have a trick for writing prose that sounds good being read out loud?
Oh, I just love... So the radio that I do is a very particular program. It's called A Point of View. And it's a BBC program. It's Radio 4. And basically, it's a 9-minute essay. It's like a personal essay. And it needs to be topical, so it needs to be related to the news in some way. But it can be quite tangential. It can come at a subject quite. So what I tried to do... When I first heard this program, I was struck, and I really hope that none of the people who make it listen to your podcast, because I was struck by how many men were on this program, and they would just do a point of view, their point of view, as mansplaining, mansplaining, but also a bit ranty and a bit like, here's me holding forth, and I'm going to tell you what I think. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something that was a bit more what I would call dialogic, a pretentious word, but something that's a bit more dialogue based. So I write my pieces like little stories, and they usually start with an anecdote where I talk to somebody, a PhD student or a postman, or and he said this and I said that, and so that the listener who's sitting in the car will hear this story and they'll be thinking, where's she going with this? What's this about? And then usually what I do is, I come out of a very particular experience, the day I lost my keys, the day I talked to that postman, or something that happened to me when I was a child, so that the listener doesn't know where I'm going. And then I I broaden out like a camera, sort of gradually panning out, and you realise, oh my goodness, she's saying something about the Ukraine crisis, or that's where she's going. So you've got these swerves along the way, and the listener literally doesn't know where you're going to take it next, and you surprise them. So that 1 minute you're talking about your conversation with the postman, and then you're in Ukraine or wherever else. So actually the model I use for this is, I don't know if you know the poet Elizabeth Bishop. Oh, I love her work. I love her work so much. So in some of her most famous poems, she will take you into something that's very, very particular and give you like incredible detail, like the patterning on the side of a fish, a waiting room, you know, that amazing poem, The Waiting Room, where a child is looking at a magazine. And you're totally in the detail. And then suddenly the camera pans back and you realise she's saying something existential. So that you go from the particular, not from the particular to the general, but from the particular to something really quite philosophical and complex. So that's what I try to do, and I try and do as many gear changes and about turns and U-turns along the way, so that the listener in 9 minutes gets, you know, quite a lot of different texture. So that's what I try and do. But I'm still learning.
Oh, yeah. And I really like how poetry has inspired the way of writing these, what end up being radio segments, and how all these different forms that we tend to separate, fiction, nonfiction, novel, critical essay, and how they really aren't as separate and binary as we sometimes make them out to be, and that good storytelling can be brought into any space that we are speaking or writing in. And now I want to go listen to your story about the postman. Like, where does that one go? I really want to know.
If you go to my website and you go to the radio broadcasting pages, all the ones I've done are there. And the one that people love most, I think, is the one I wrote. It's called Reflections on My Mother's Kenwood Mixer. It's all about a particular machine that my mother had when I was a child, which we did a lot of cooking with. And then there's another one which is called On Waiting, which is about losing my keys whilst out in the countryside during lockdown with my daughters. So those two, On Waiting and the Kenwood Mixer piece, are the two.
So let's talk about your latest book, Dark Earth, which was released earlier this summer, 2022. I'll read a little excerpt for our listeners. The year is 500 AD. Sisters Isla and Blue live in the shadows of the ghost city, the abandoned ruins of the once glorious, mile-wide Roman settlement Londinium on the banks of the River Thames. But the small island they call home is also a place of exile for Isla, Blue, and their father, a legendary blacksmith accused of using dark magic to make his fire-tongue swords. When he dies suddenly, the sisters find themselves facing enslavement by the local warlord and his cruel, power-hungry son. Their only option is to escape to the ghost city, where they discover an underworld of rebel women living secretly amid the ruins. But if Isla and Blue are to survive the men who hunt them and protect their new community, they will need to use all their skill and ingenuity, as well as the magic of their foremothers, to fight back. So, okay, reading that was the point where Julie and I are like, okay, let's call up Rebecca. We want to read this book and talk to her about it.
Yeah.
So setting a story in the Dark Ages, 500 AD, what interested you? What kind of sparked telling a story in that time and place?
I've written novels set in the 17th century. I wrote one novel set in the 17th century. That's the earliest I'd gone in history. But back, I don't know, it's probably about 10 years ago, I was travelling down through Jordan with 3 friends in a car. We drove from the top of Jordan, it's a long thin country, all the way down through the desert, and every few miles it seemed there were Roman cities just sticking up out of the sand, you know, amazing. Some of them really, really complete, you know, like you walk down a street, a cobbled street, and there'd be columns on both sides and temples. So I think that was where it started for me. I was just suddenly really obsessed with ruined cities and imagining what it would be like to live in the hinterland of one. So trying to imagine, if you were an Anglo-Saxon coming into Britain after the Romans had left, and you walked through that mile-wide ruined city, what would you see? What would you feel? What would you think? And if you knew nothing about those people, I call them the Sun Kings, but, essentially calling them they're the Romans. If you knew nothing about the Romans, then what would you think the Romans were? If you lived in a wooden hut and you're walking through this, vast stone city with all of these statues and, what would that have done to your head? So that's what I began with, I think. And then I started researching, and then I committed to writing that book and realized that, it was an extraordinary task because nobody knows. There's no manuscripts or there's no written accounts of this period at all. It's literally the darkest corner of the Dark Ages. So archaeologists just kept saying to me, you're mad, why not choose a period that we know at least something about? So the research for the book involved interviewing archaeologists, reading loads of papers, reading loads of books, and of course realizing that because there are such gaps in what we know, archaeologists didn't always agree with each other about how to interpret the archaeological remains. But my story began back in 1968. An archaeologist found a brooch in a site in current London, which was basically a Roman bathhouse that had belonged to the Roman city of Londinium. And everybody assumed that, we know that very few people went into the ruined city for 400 years after the Romans left. And people have theories about that. They think maybe the people who lived in the surrounding area thought the place was haunted or it was dangerous. They didn't go in. We know that because there's so little stuff that people have found in that 400 years when the city was abandoned. But this archaeologist found a brooch, and it was sitting on top of the fallen roof tiles of a private bathhouse on the north bank of the Thames. And he could tell it was an Anglo-Saxon brooch. It belonged to a woman. So that meant that this woman, for sure, walked across the broken roof tiles of a Roman bathhouse and dropped her brooch. And that's what I began with. That blew my mind. She went in there. Nobody else she knew was going into the city. She went in there. Why? Was she on the run? Was this a love tryst? Was she in danger? So once I had that brooch, which was my Elizabeth Bishop focus, I guess, then I could start to come out from there and find the women, in this case 2 sisters, who might have gone into the city. My novel is the answer to why did she go in there,
So then, okay, so you started with the brooch and you started with all these questions of who is that woman? What was the first image or the first scene, or what was the first sort of concrete thing that you wrote?
It was the opening chapter, because my 2 sisters, I knew quite early on that my 2 sisters had been exiled. So if you're a smith in this period, people think that people were a bit frightened of smiths because they could do magical things with fire. So if you can do magical things with fire, maybe you can do, maybe you've got dark magic. So quite often smiths' forges were on the outskirts of the village. And I also knew that my smith, the father of these 2 sisters, was making really high-end swords. I mean, the kinds of swords that would be a Maserati now, And so his skills would have been very valuable, and he might have been... So what happens at the beginning of my novel is that the smith and his daughters have been exiled to an island in the Thames, so the local overlord can make sure that he makes swords only for the overlord. And they've been there for 5 years, just the 2 sisters, teenagers, and their father. And their father's getting old, so the young girl, Isla, the elder of the 2 sisters, has been making the swords for him and with him. She's been trained to do it. And that is absolutely forbidden in this period. In my novel, it's absolutely forbidden. The local overlords, women don't go into forges. They're not allowed anywhere near them. They'll curse the sword. They'll curse everything. Their bad luck, etc. So Isla has this big secret that she can make these swords. So I wrote the opening chapter where the dilemma, suddenly becomes evident that the father dies in the first couple of pages of the book, and the two sisters now have to figure out what they're going to do, because their father is what's keeping them on the island and keeping them fed and everything. And now, do they confess that they know how to make swords? Do they pretend that their father's still alive? So that's the dilemma that the book starts with. So for me, also, it gave me this lovely moment where I could have the two sisters are up on the mound on the mud island, looking across the water to see the ruined city on the north bank of the Thames. And Isla is always wondering, what's going on in there? And, oh, I wish we could go and visit it. And, it's her big obsession. So that's how the novel opens, with the two sisters looking at the ruined walls of the city of Londinium.
So Dark Earth is firmly set in the past, but touches on many themes that resonate with modern audiences, particularly the relationships between a lot of the characters. So can you walk us through how you kind of wove those strands together?
Yeah, when I'm writing historical fiction, I don't start by thinking, oh, I want to write about, this theme or that theme, because they're modern themes. But I think or for me anyway, particularly with this book, once I started getting into the heads of the women, the two sisters in particular, and exploring their relationship with each other, and then later with the other women in the novel, it was almost as if, I don't know, I was looking for relevant themes, because when you read a book, you want to feel as though there is, the world that you're reading about is both very alien and very different and very fascinating, but at the same time that there are universal themes and universal dilemmas. I think my book is a feminist book. I think it explores the coming of patriarchy. But my sisters would never have used the word patriarchy. They wouldn't,
Yeah.
They weren't feminists in the sense that we would understand it now. But at the same time, they were resourceful, they were plucky, they were independent. So, I think a lot of people get very hot under the collar about projecting kind of modern ideas back into the past. And I think sometimes you read books where you just think, no, those characters are using language that wouldn't be appropriate to their time. But it seems to me that those sisters, and particularly the women that they meet, who have had terrible experiences at the hands of very cruel men, would have found ways of fighting back, of supporting each other, about securing their independence, about making decisions that allowed them to survive on their own terms. So in this novel, for instance, the women don't have an army. They need to fight the local overlord and his men, but they don't have an army and they don't have swords. So they have to use their wits. So it was all for me about, if you were in this situation, what would you do? If you were on the run from some cruel men, what would you do? So I think the book ends up being a feminist book, and it explores multiculturalism as well. But my characters would never use the term multicultural. They're just living in a world in which people come from all over the Roman Empire. And so those women would have worshipped different gods, and they would have come from different races. So I have a woman who comes from modern day Hungary. I have a male character in the novel who comes from North Africa, because we know that Roman soldiers, and he comes from a long line of Roman soldiers, they came from all over the world. So, the book explores things that are important to us, or themes that are important to us, but not at the expense of it being also true that these things would have been relevant to my characters as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like people who get frustrated by, I suppose, having a feminist way of seeing the past, perhaps, or, and people who get bothered by that, I feel like it's sort of supposing that the people in the past were, like, less than us somehow, that they would not have fought for themselves, that they would not have imagined a different way of doing things. So I think, limiting people from history is just a severe lack of imagination.
And also, I think it's also quite sexist in a way. I think, because I think often behind this, oh, that's nonsense, you're projecting a feminist sensibility onto women in the past. Well, the assumption then is, well, were all women compliant in the past? Did none of them fight back? Were none of them, free thinkers.
Yeah.
Were none of them feisty? It's like, okay, they may not have had the language or the political language that we have to describe our feminism, but nonetheless, women, of course, through all ages have fought back against cruelty and,
Yes. And it isn't like, women of the early 20th century suffragette movements or women of the 70s just woke up one day and decided, enough with this. It was generations and generations, millennia of our world and society developing the way it has, and women finding ways to speak up and to push back within their contexts, and sometimes breaking down those contexts and building new ones. So that was one thing I really did appreciate in your novel too, is the world building, because we don't have much information about this world and what it would have looked like at that time. We don't have that historical research, but you can make some assumptions and some understandings of what would it have been like, as you've raised it, for people who were brought from across the Roman Empire into this land, and what would that have experience been like. So it's not that characters are just popping up from nowhere without an explanation of how they got there and how they live their lives.
Yeah, and also I was lucky enough to work with two amazing archaeologists who, one was a historian and one was an archaeologist, both experts on this period. And I said to them, look, this may not be to your taste. It may not be the kind of book that you would read. It's an adventure story. It's got supernatural things going on, but would you read it and just tell me if there was anything that feels out of place or that can't be true? So they were brilliant. So, they were absolutely brilliant. They went through the finished book in its, third draft or something and said, things like, okay, get this one. I had rats in my ruined city. My archaeologist said there are no rats after the Romans left. For about 200 years, there's no rats in the archaeological record. And that's because rats follow surplus. They follow grain stores.
Right.
So for 200 years after the Romans left, there was no surplus. There were no grain stores. People were just living a hand-to-mouth existence. So the rats disappear.
Wow.
Yeah, doesn't that blow your mind? So I had to go back through and take the rats out.
Yeah.
I didn't have lots of rats, but I had a few.
I'm imagining this whole subplot where there's a rat kingdom, rat friends. That would have really changed the novel.
They claimed the brooch as their own.
Yeah, the sequel.
Sequel, not the rats. Wow.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And also she said, so you've got a few scenes where your characters sit down and seem to lean back in their chairs. And she said it's 200 years before any seats have backs. Right?
That is an important detail.
Isn't that incredible?
Never would have thought of that. Like, when did our chairs get backs?
Right.
There were stools and there were benches, but not seats with backs. So you can't have your characters kind of lolling.
Right.
Because, they didn't loll. There were seats and stools.
Wow.
So that was really interesting. So yeah, there was a lot of that going on.
Such tiny details that we take for granted of if someone said, oh, draw me a chair, draw me something you sit on, it's always going to have a back. That's just what is in our minds. But at a certain point, someone had to decide, you know what? My back is tired. Can we add something to this chair so I can leave?
Yeah, and that person made a lot of money. The person who invented the seat back. I think probably there are examples of, seats with backs in China and all over the place. But in this period, there were no seat backs.
So you mentioned how there are some supernatural elements. There's a bit of magic. There's a bit of religion. And there aren't a lot of records of this period. And so what were you drawing from to sort of construct that aspect of the story?
Yeah, it was a difficult one. And it was really important to me because, I think sort of going back to my childhood as well, it's one of the things that when I have taught historical fiction, I think it's one of the things that people leave out at their peril in a way, that so many historical characters would have belief systems. They would have gods in their heads. They would have been having dialogues with their gods in their heads. They would have been making deals with gods. They would have been sacrificing to gods. And I think that's a real conundrum for people who write historical fiction, because many of our readers today will not have that kind of sensibility. Some will, but most won't, probably. And so how do you create the inner world of a character who has a belief system without alienating your reader.
Mm-hmm.
Or making them think this is all a bit kind of, woohoo. But it did seem to me, because we know, okay, just to give you an example, we know votive offerings, i.e. people taking their favourite necklace or their favourite bracelet and breaking it and throwing it into the water was happening a lot, like all the time, particularly into water and into marshes, because people would be buying themselves some luck. They would say to the god, I want to cross this river, so I'm going to sacrifice this before I go, or I'm going to sacrifice a goat or a dog or a necklace or something. So there's a lot of bargaining going on, a lot of saying to the gods, if I do this, will you keep me safe or get my grandmother well again? So that's what I started with. I knew that my characters would have different gods, but that what they would have in common is that negotiating relationship with their gods a lot of the time. And that, almost certainly a community of people who are living together and worshipping different gods. Well, my community are very respectful of each other's beliefs, and so there aren't feuds going on and things like that. So yeah, that's it was important to me, and it was important to try and get inside the heads of my sisters as well, as they got frustrated with their gods, and then they came back to their gods, and the way in which they might believe, for instance, in second sight, and also in things like the touch, which is, if you have the touch, it means you can cure people. So all of those superstitions and that sense of, that person has powers, that person has a degree of spirituality or a way of speaking to the gods that is more powerful than anybody else in the community. So yeah, that's how it came about. And it was one of the most interesting things for me in the book, was to try to make that inner world as well as the outer world.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed the element of this magic and thinking of it in like almost a folklore religious setting within this historical novel. I thought it was a really beautiful blend of like topics or themes that we might say, one is fantasy or that is historical fiction, but as we talked about earlier, it's the spectrum. It's blending these forms. It's not making clear lines between, if you're making up a magical religious experience, that has to be fantasy. It's not historical, realistic fiction anymore, but instead blurring that line and realizing and recognizing that while many of our readers today, many of us don't have these ongoing dialogues with gods and bartering, and those might be newer things for us, but to read it in the novel is to understand like, that is a way people lived their lives in the past. And I think also helps, as we talked about with weaving between the modern themes and the historical fiction setting. I think the element of religion really helped me ground myself in, these are modern themes, but also we are in a historical past.
Yeah, and a world in which people have a different relationship with their dead as well. That we know that people in this period and later as well, that sense, not that there are ghosts perhaps, and that's a very kind of particular idea about the dead, but the idea that the dead might still be about us somehow. They might still be present even in their absence. So I wanted to create that, not so that the reader thinks, oh yes, she's seen a ghost, but rather the reader would begin to understand that world in which the boundary between the living and the dead was actually quite permeable.
So wrapping up our discussion, you've taught writing for many years, and just curious if you have any parting words of advice for young writers, any common mistakes you saw in students over the years, or maybe advice you've been able to take in as you've continued to expand your writing into the genre of novels.
Yeah, well, two things I think really. Just the first is an obvious one, and I'm sure people give this advice all the time, is just keep moving forward. Don't be tempted to keep going back and polishing your beginning. I've seen students do that. I've seen young writers do that again and again. They have this fantastic opening and it's polished, to a deep shine, but they're nervous about going forward. I just think you have to write a rough first draft of the whole thing and then start your polishing. And that's hard. It's hard to do that because, editing is fun, but I think you should leave the editing until you've got your manuscript and not keep going back. And the other thing is something a bit more philosophical, I suppose. I have a friend who's a poet, And he said to me casually, almost like a throwaway line, he said, it's really important to me to write what only I can write. And it took me weeks to mull over that. It was so valuable to me to think that my experience, weird childhood that I've had, you know, my stealing a book from the library when I was 8 or 9, you know, that weird experience is my gold dust. You know, that is the gold that I carry. Not all of that experience was happy, much of it was troubled. But I have the beautiful experience of being able to write what only I can write. And to do that, I have to draw on not, you know, straightforward autobiographical material, but the deep experiences that only I have had as an individual. And that's a blend of things. So when I lose my way in a novel, I quite often ask myself, what about this novel or this story is a tale that only you can tell? And get back and connect to that when you get tempted to do lots of fancy stuff, you know. What is it that's coming from your deep core and that only you can write? And I don't always get that right, but it's a useful thing for me. It's a useful tool for me.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that.
Another way of putting it, I think, is don't be afraid to be weird. You know, it's like we're all a bit weird and we have weird ways of seeing, and if you can get that down, you know, not being weird for weird's sake, but like the things that only you feel and think and see are precious things, and you know, we should be proud of them, however strange they might be. And I do think my books are quite strange. But you know, but I'm proud of that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
That's wonderful.
I really enjoyed that. I'm going to be thinking about that. I'm like, I need to transition, but that was so good. For people who have read your book, they have listened to this podcast, they have gone to the store to purchase your book, they have read it, and they loved it, and now what would you recommend they read next? Or, on the other hand, for listeners who have not read it yet, what is a book that, you know, if they enjoyed that book, they would also like yours? Either one.
Yeah, there's a book that I read recently called Quen, Cwen, Quen, by a writer called Alice Albina. I think it's out in the States as well as in the UK. It was published, I think, last year. It's a very strange and very wonderful, very gripping book about an island in which it's a contemporary novel in which the women gradually take over. They take over pretty much everything. And then bad things start to happen and there's kickback. It's told by lots of different narrators, lots of different characters who've been part of this experience. It's a feminist book, but also strange and haunting. The characters are fantastic. It reminded me a little bit of Margaret Atwood.
Oh, that sounds so fascinating.
Yeah. I know. I'm like, that sounds like something that we would read for this podcast. We should add it to the list.
Taking notes. Adding to the list.
Good.
Add to the list.
What about you, Julia? What would you recommend for listeners?
Yeah. So I think for me, thinking along the lines of, this is more fantasy, I suppose, than historical fiction. But again, as we've discussed, blurry lines. So I would say Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, which we have done an episode on, but it's the pre-Columbian America.
Yeah, Central America.
America. Yeah, where it's bringing some life to it and some fantasy, and there's a lot of religious conflict in that one as well. Different, so yeah, I think brilliant book. Probably recommend that one.
I was also thinking that for the religion element of kind of imagining what it would be to have different political groups, different people groups, different individuals from different communities, and how they see the world differently through the way they see the world, and how those different points of view conflict. Okay, Two books I was thinking of, Rebecca, when you mentioned footnotes, I immediately thought of A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, because I love the footnotes. And anyone who's listened to Julie and I talk about that book will know that I made the blunder of listening to the audiobook version, which didn't include the footnotes, which I think is so disappointing. Because then when I started flipping through the printed version, I was like, there is a whole layer to this book I lost. So that book is quite wonderful. It is also has elements of magical circumstances within a realistic setting, but set more in present day.
Yeah.
I was also thinking of Circe by Madeline Miller for, again, the elements of magic and fantasy.
A woman on an island.
Yeah, women on an island, tied with the modern themes and that we discussed as far as how do women push back within their cultural context.
That is a good one.
So closing out, we'd love to hear, what are things that you're currently obsessed with, Rebecca? What are things bringing you joy? Books, TV, movies, food, your dog, anything?
My dog
like
always.
To shout out.
But no, I'm in the process of moving from. So I gave up my job last year. I sold my house. I am now so I'm moving a long way south. And I've bought a house that is in a little town, a little witchy town called Lewis. And when I say witchy, it really is quite a witchy town. And my new house needs massive renovation. I have to wait for 2 months before I move in. So I am currently obsessed with the names of paint colours.
Oh, yes.
And I have ordered a lot of paint charts, and my son is an art dealer and has a beautiful eye. He and I share a very similar taste. So when I showed him my sitting room, he said, "Oh, you're going to need a rainy pink for that." And I thought, "Oh, what's a rainy pink? That's fantastic. It's like pink with a touch of blue, maybe." Anyway, so we've been sending each other colours backwards and forwards to try and get close to this rainy pink. But yes, there is a paint company called Farrow and Ball, and they have the most extraordinary names for colours, like elephant's breath.
Wow.
Isn't that just great? Elephant's breath. I think I'm remembering it right. And it reminds me, so when I wrote my first book, it was about Darwin, and it was about Darwin on the Beagle, or at least part of the book was about Darwin on the Beagle. And he was a young man collecting specimens, and he was having to describe them, and he had to use a colour chart that all naturalists used. And those colours had the most extraordinary names. So they would, they were also like Farrow and Ball. So a particular white might be eyeball white. Eyeball white. So what's eyeball white? And there would be like 10 different whites, and they would all have these body parts attached to them. Yeah, so colour charts. That's a particular joy of mine right now.
I love that.
Yeah. All right. How about you, V?
So I recently read This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. Julie and I have literally rearranged our schedules to record an episode on this book next week, because we just texted each other a lot of all caps messages as we were reading This Is How You Lose the Time War. It is a delight. It is a novel that Julia was recommended a while back, and I'm like, oh, that sounds fascinating. I'll add it to my reading list, and I stayed up till 3 a.m. finishing it. It was just a thrill the whole way around.
I finished it yesterday, and I am still reeling from that story. It was so good.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Talk about an obsession. I spend at least 20 minutes every day since I finished reading the book just thinking about the ending. So I also, unfortunately, came down with COVID. I finally caught the plague about a month ago, and my coping mechanism was watching all of Only Murders in the Building. The podcast jokes and asides through the whole 2 seasons is delightful. And yes.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those, and I would also add an album I've been listening to on repeat this week has been Marchita by Silvana Estrada. Just the most unique voice and just incredibly musically talented. So, thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us. This was so fun and enlightening, and I'm walking away with so many thoughts. So how can listeners follow your work? Where can they find your book?
All good bookstores, I guess. I mean, it's hard to say, but it's hard for me to say where they can find it in America, but I imagine most independent bookstores. I have a website. So there's quite a lot on my website about how I wrote the book and the research behind it and the brooch and the dark soil and where the title came from. So if people do read the book and want to read more, then they can go to my website. And I'm on Twitter. Rebecca Stott 64 is, I think, my handle. That's where they can. And yeah, Dark Earth should be easy to find. It's been out in the States since July, in hardback and in audiobooks as well.
So thank you all, listeners, for joining us. Julie and I will be back with our full-length episode in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be talking about This Is How You Lose the Time War.
Yeah.
Because we cannot wait to get that episode into your ears.
Yeah.
So thank you so much again, Rebecca, for joining us. And we can't wait to read what else you write.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Such an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julie and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at Book Club with JV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Febland. Until next time, happy reading.